soir d'accueillir parmi nous le professeur Daniel Dresch, qui est un collègue et ami de longue date désormais, qui est professeur de sciences politiques à l'université de York à Toronto et qui est également chercheur au Robert School et qui a participé à cet ouvrage dont certains étudiants connaissent l'existence ici et que j'ai eu le plaisir de traduire. Et il a publié dernièrement cet ouvrage, Defiant Publics, dont j'ai parlé en séminaire à certains. Pour en savoir plus sur le professeur Daniel Dresch, eh bien, vous allez sur le site de KO International où il y a une notice bio à la rubrique réseau de KO International, puisque le professeur Daniel Dresch est membre du réseau de KO International, auquel il contribue substantiellement avec de nombreux articles qu'il nous a donnés pour la rubrique Fil d'Ariane. Et vous avez aussi une notice, vous avez deux notices bio en fait, une qui est intégrée dans la liste des chercheurs du réseau de KO International, notice bio, photo et tutti quanti, et également sur le blog et sur le site, nous avons mis une note de présentation pour ce séminaire de ce soir, avec une note de synthèse que nous a transmise le professeur Dresch sur la séance de ce soir, et il y a là aussi une notice bio qui retrace ses dernières interventions, ses dernières recherches et ses dernières publications. Bien, alors le principe de ce séminaire, c'est de donner la parole dans un instant. Je vais donner la parole au professeur Dresch qui va intervenir, je l'avais dit aux étudiants auxquels j'avais donné l'information, qui va intervenir en anglais, mais ça ne pose pas de problème pour vous, j'en suis certaine, et qui ensuite nous fera l'amitié de vous répondre en français. Vous pourrez lui poser des questions en français, il vous répondra en français.
C'est parfait. Voilà, merci.
Voilà, tu as la parole, Daniel.
Oui, en fait. Merci pour l'invitation d'être ici. Pour une raison ou une autre, je préfère parler en anglais pour la présentation, pour la conférence, mais je suis très à l'aise en français aussi. Mais c'est plus facile pour moi en anglais, et pour vous, c'est une occasion, voilà, de pratiquer un peu votre anglais qui est fiable et agréable comme langue alternative. So, what do we have? So what is the subject tonight? The subject tonight is to look at new social media. So, by new social media, I mean 5 things. How many of you have a mobile? How many are on Facebook? How many Twitter? Voilà, spécial. How many Skype?
Venez, venez.
Voilà. So, we are in this new social media has created a very different environment for 2 reasons. 3 reasons. First, because it offers the possibility for people all over the world, or here, between friends, between strangers, to dialogue, to form discursive communities. So this is the first important thing. So it's a kind of, to locate it in literature, a Habermasian moment. The idea is that strangers can meet and discuss, persuade, and take action together. So this is, in some ways, quite revolutionary. Because while theorists, when he wrote Habermas, his great study, in the 80s, in the late 70s, 80s, he never had the possibility to have a communications model that allowed people to be informed and to become social actors. It's a very deep problem, because you think about the Frankfurt School, they saw mass culture as narcoticizing the individual. So media this new social media is a form of empowerment, and it's about soft power. The idea, the power of ideas and persuasion. This sounds simple, but it is complex. Because the second thing is that there is a puzzle. Puzzle is, if people talk, do they walk? What is the link between talk and action? And until the... Am I speaking too fast? Too fast? Until the Obama presidency, many people thought that Facebook was a diversion, something amusing, and divertissement. So no one took social media seriously, or few. It was a thing you did with friends for dating. How many of you saw the movie? What was it called? The movie about Facebook.
Social network.
What?
Social network.
Yeah. So what was this movie about? Why was Facebook created? It was to have sex and dating at your age. Right? These were guys who said, let's connect up. And then people can get together. They have parties. You can take advantage of these social networks for divertissement. So there was no social purpose. There was no bigger story. But the Obama presidency changed that because he used Facebook, social networking, just like Castells had predicted. You know what Castells? The great sociologist.
Robert Castel.
No, it's not Robert. It's no, Castells. He wrote these 3 volumes. It's not Robert. It's I just can't remember his name. What? Berry? Champagne. So, I'll get to Castells. So, Castells writes these 3 volumes on the information economy society. And he says something profoundly has changed in capitalism. Right? That in the information economy, people are able to connect and stay together and be linked together through new information technology. So this idea was first really used by Obama in the election. So how does it work? So what happened was you have a group of you on Facebook. And the people said, well, how can we help Obama? And they said, eventually, after all the talk, we have to talk and walk. Online, offline, the new binary. And people were invited over to someone's house in Dallas or in California or in Boston or wherever. And they said, let's help Obama by going door to door to challenge his rival. But this was, in some ways, not so innovative. But what made it innovative is that Obama had a great deal of money, and he he established 80 bureaus around the United States and hired organizers to organize these micro-activists who went door to door for Obama. And he created a movement. And this movement succeeded with the young people, with minorities, particularly with Hispanic Americans, 18 to 25-year-old people, and other communities. Right? And what happened with Obama, that he defeated McCain, and he had the highest turnout ever of any president, electoral turnout, the highest ever of any electoral presidency since Johnson's win in 1965. So this is interesting for us as theorists and analysts, because it was an event that legitimized the technology. And if you know a bit about Facebook, you will know that on Facebook there is an app, an application that says, form a social network. So they were so smart to go from beer and sex to social networking. Right? So this idea of using information for a social purpose lies behind the idea. But there is a problem. Why is it that sometimes people talk but don't walk, and sometimes they talk and walk? So if you, from a social perspective, you have to say, if you do both, you get a big bounce. You make an impact. Right? So, we come to this second legitimizing event, which was Occupy Wall Street movement. Now, I don't know what you saw in France, but most of us underestimated the size and magnitude of the Occupy Wall Street movement. First, it wasn't Zuccotti Park. It involved about 100 cities in the United States which had these Occupy movements. They physically occupied a park or some public space. So this is very important. Thousands of people. And then there was, just as Joseph has said many times, I'm sure, the transnational aspect of the Occupy Wall Street movement, because you had it in Canada, big occupations in Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal, in London, in other parts of Europe. So this raises a very important question, is how does it differ from the anti-globalization movement that we saw in the Battle of Seattle and many other meetings of the IMF and the World Bank? Something has changed, right? So first, as social scientists, we want to think, what is different? I will tell you what was different. First, it was directed not against global governance institutions, but against powerful economic elites who have been complacent and accepting of obscene amounts of wealth accumulation and the rise of social inequality. So if you look at Roderick or Stiglitz or Milanovic, these are very people, or the World Bank, the IMF, what we see across the global north and the global south is that in a period of global monetarism, inequality has grown faster than economic growth has occurred. So you have high growth economies, China, 10% growth, India, 8% growth, Europe before the crisis, quite strong. But inequality has accelerated, has increased faster than annual growth. So what we see is a polarization in societies everywhere between the top 0.1% and everyone else. Of course, I'm simplifying. But the second point is that we thought, oh, people are accepting. Publics are passive. They are phantom. They go with the flow. They are pessimistic. They are cynical. There is no alternative to global neoliberalism. So, this explosion of global activism is about we are the 99%. So it's a kind of success of the short-term success of the Occupy Wall Street is it created a global political brand, which represented social justice and the belief that government has a responsibility to be redistributive and to supply public goods. So it's a kind of line in the sand. A line in the sand. So imagine from anti-globalization to saying our governments, our elites are responsible for the growth in inequality and the breakdown of society that is occurring. So, in those two important ways, of course, right, first it's local rather than global, or local transnational, and secondly, this kind of instant global brand that no advertising agency could invent. Right? This is not marketing, nail polish, dresses, cars. This is a kind of branding of an idea. And I think it was seen in the end, though not initially, as significant because it was non-violent and it was, secondly, spontaneous. Right? It was something new. It was a surprise. It had novelty. Novelty in the Schumpeter sense of the term, to create something new through creative destruction. So, this is complex here, because there were also two weaknesses you could see. First, one was, would it coalesce into a bigger movement? How would a movement that was so decentralized, leaderless, with so many demands, how could it acquire a more robust organizational form? You're with me on this? The problem is organisation. Parce que c'était un mouvement super décentralisé. Il n'y a aucune... Moi, je parle en français un peu. C'est amusant. C'est la fin de la journée. Peut-être leurs oreilles sont fatiguées. Deuxièmement, sans leader. Et en fait, quand on suit un peu le mouvement, quand il passe à la télé, il n'y a pas une position, il n'y a pas de revendication claire et simple. Ils sont très généralisés. Fin de la pauvreté, ok. Changement de la politique monétaire, investissement pour les logements publics. C'est tout généralisé. Mais c'est très intéressant qu'une chose qui est très claire est que les médias, finalement, acceptaient l'idée que c'était un mouvement anticapitaliste. C'est quelque chose, hein? Parce que le mot anticapitaliste, c'est une sorte de propriété de le mouvement trotskiste. Personne ne parle d'anticapitalisme. Il parle de réforme de l'économie globale. Donc, ça ajoute quelque chose sur le plan de le vocabulaire politique moderne. Okay, that's enough English. Non.
Spanish now.
Mon cerveau, c'est espagnol. So the first thing is the faiblesse de l'organisation. Même s'il est transnational, il n'a pas une façon de coordonner le mouvement aux États-Unis, le mouvement au Canada, le mouvement avec d'autres expressions. But nonetheless, it was the most significant political mobilization since 1968. Ça fait 40 ans. Et ça fait 40 ans, c'est tout. And there is something taking place tied to the new social media. So first, it is a phenomenon. It's not simply numbers, but I want to tell you the numbers. All this has taken place in roughly a decade, or 15 years. So the internet began as an entity in 1994. So 1994. There were about 20 million people on it when it began. Today, there is 1.2 billion. 1,2 milliard. So it's just as a social scientist, analyst, you have to know what the evidence is. Secondly, if you look at telephones, which are small computers today, c'est le mobile, ça ressemble beaucoup à un ordinateur. 2.4 billion in the world. Facebook has 500 million people who are on it, not hardcore, maybe 350. Le noyau, c'est beaucoup plus petit, mais 350 millions, c'est pas mal. And even when you go on Skype, which is quite remarkable for diasporic communities to keep in touch, you will look at the number on the lower left of the screen that says 32 million people on Skype, 42 million, 19 million. But it's very interesting and important in the Arab Spring time, in Iran, in Russia, wherever there are these social movements, there are diasporic communities. And it is the new information technology that links this diasporic community back to its homeland. So if you're an Arab in Toronto, you know immediately, or you want to phone your brother or sister-in-law in Cairo, in Caire. They're back and forth all day, telling them, they say, I just came from a demonstration, or Syria, a terrible situation. They phone each other, and they tell each other. So, when I talked about new social media, I left one element out, and that is Al Jazeera. You need a global broadcaster to get the message out, to show, to report on events, not from the CNN perspective, not from the perspective of TV5 or BBC World. No. It's other shows. It's a Media Quick. It's a McDonald's. So, this Al Jazeera is a phenomenon because you have computers, I know, and you can go online and you can watch the news. I don't know if they broadcast. They might broadcast in French. Of course, I live in Toronto and they broadcast in English because I'm on the English service. But it's very important because it presents the news in a different way for the Arab world and for the non-Arab speaking world. You know what they say? All the news from every angle. So when events take place in Syria, the people in Syria who have participated in these demonstrations, these murderous demonstrations, they bring their cell phone and they record everything. And this recording, document it, I call it. Documented. Is, I think, a new phenomena for governments to deal with because Al Jazeera says, we cannot verify the report. They can only show you the pictures. It's interesting. We cannot verify ce qu'on voit, c'est la vérité. C'est-à-dire quoi? C'est-à-dire toute la vérité. Mais c'est l'amateur, c'est le gens dans le rue qui prennent la photo de ce qui passait. So this is new in international relations because in the past, all this kind of information was controlled and filtered by the state. And when you followed the events of the Arab Springtime in Tahrir Square or other places, the interviews are all saying the same thing. We, for the first time, can speak in public, and we are no longer afraid. So this idea of creating a public sphere, a place for debate, discussion, mobilization, is new for places which had dictatorships and police states. But it is also represents something bigger or different. And that is your attitude to authority. Because when you can be informed, there is this change of mentality. It may be false. It may be exaggerated. But when you're informed, you believe you should decide. It is the decline of authority, like in my family. When we, I'll tell you this minute, so we have studies which shows that when you ask people, is the father the master of the house in France or in Canada, the United States, what we see over the last 15 years is in a declining number of homes, the father is the authority. So for the numbers for Canada, 1995, when asked, is father tops? Pops is tops, dans le vernacular. Pops is tops. Papa c'est le mieux. 31% said yes. 10 years later, 19%. In 1995, 31% said yes, father is the master. 10 years later, it declined to 19%. And not surprisingly, when they do the numbers, same study for the United States, it showed that in 1995, the Americans responding to this survey said 33% said the father was tops, but by the Bush era, senior, the number had gone up to 43%. So we can see that Tea Party republicanism reestablishes the structure of patriarchy, whereas other societies who have other values or other political cultures, the decline of authority is evident everywhere, with religion and the priest or the rabbi, with school, with professors. It makes our life difficult, my dear. Students come to me, they say, I don't accept this grade. So I say, what do you want me to do? Because they have a right, as students, to have their paper reread. Independently, if you feel you're not being treated fairly, what is the liberal answer to this? The liberal democratic answer, there must be a third party. There must be someone else to adjudicate. Because perhaps I overreacted. Or perhaps I didn't agree with the perspective. Or perhaps there are 1,000 reasons. But you can see, if you can't resolve it between you two. Students at our university have access to liberal democratic process. So this change around being informed and authority, I think is also part of this movement of Occupy Wall Street. Without demands, as I said, clear demands, without really leaders, it nonetheless became very effective because it took a long time, because it wasn't a demonstration of a day, but it lasted 3 months. And eventually, all these protesters were expelled from the parks. So, on spurious legal grounds, there is you have to know a bit about American law, and Canadian law is quite similar. I don't know. I don't think in France you could remove someone from the park. But they said you had a right to be in the park, but not a right to camp in the park. You see, to use access to the park. On a de protection de la Constitution, ça protège quoi, la liberté d'expression. Mais c'est pas la même chose d'une occupation d'une place publique, c'est pas un droit constitutionnel. Il y a des restrictions sur cette activité. But this Occupy Wall Street movement, nonetheless, and this is one that represents, I think, two things that we should think about together. And then maybe 3 things. But anyway, 2 things initially. So, the first is, what is different about this Web 2.0 technology from other, I've got to find a little thing here. No. This is a very embarrassing moment, but I'll keep talking. What? This one? Which one? No? 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 Merci. Come in. Ah, here it is. Here it is. Okay. So this is actually worth a lot to you, 2 minutes sound. So what is different about the technology? Technology is interesting because we don't want to say technology changes everything. It might change many things, but it's how it's used, which is always important. You cannot be a determinist. If everyone went on Facebook, you can't say everyone would become a social activist. Right? You cannot say that. Because there are other things happening on the web. But I am interested in the new rules of the game, made possible by this social media. So let's think about it, because probably you haven't thought enough about this. So I just mean this as a kind of, how do we theorize? How do we stand back from Facebook, the internet, Skype? What's so special about it? Okay, the first property is that it is a point-to-point communication system. You click and you talk. That's quite revolutionary as you think about it. You click, you talk. There's no one in between, right? So it has built into it kind of user-driven, and it's quite open because it can go anywhere. And so it is a decentralized system, right? It's very unusual because you think of radio and television, you can't, it's all centralized for complex reasons in broadcast, in fixed capital, right? You have television studios, radio studios, in a huge infrastructure, you have thousands of people. But this new social media is decentralized. There's no hub, there's no core. There's only hubbub. Je parle ici un équivalent. Équivalent en français. Hubbub, c'est quand tout le monde parle au même temps. C'est la hubbub. Bzzz, comme ça. So, it is an interesting phenomenon. There's no hub, but a lot of action. The third thing is it is interactive. You can talk to anyone, anywhere. And this is the fourth point is, and you can ask me questions, we can discuss it, you don't have to believe me, but it's interesting to think about what is special about new social media. The other thing is that no authentication is needed when you use it. You don't say, hello, je suis Jacques, je suis Marie, c'est ma maison, j'habite rue XYZ. It's very unusual. There's no authentication. Because you could have a system based on authentication. So this means it's open to all. Third, and another point is that there is no hierarchy in the web. It's very flat. You don't have to, there's no ostensible authority, though from a Foucaultian point of view, which I will come to at the end, that it gives, that there is a Foucaultian aspect of surveillance, right? Information is always a site of surveillance and discipline. But it's very difficult to control it in a Foucaultian manner. That's the thing. It doesn't mean it's not happening. But Foucault and Habermas are eternal dancing partners, right? Because there's always surveillance, but this is very open, and the needle can go to one end or the other. So you have to always say, is the needle more to the Habermas end of the spectrum, or is it moving to the Foucaultian? Right? Because surveillance, wherever you have advances in communication, you must have advances in surveillance. The two go together. The more open the system, the more people listen. So when you go, particularly on Facebook, which is interesting, remember it's an obsession to tell all. It's life without curtains. Remember, you were growing up. You're young. You can remember a few years ago, right? Your mother told you, never say anything about yourself. Never give out your name. Never do this. Never do that. It's a complete reversal. Privacy was protection. Now people have a mania to tell all. Now it's a very superficial. Well, it can be superficial, it cannot. But there is something prototypical and unique about Facebook. Because when we were kids, me a long time ago, you recently, and you're in the schoolyard, you're 6 years old, you look out at the schoolyard, you're trembling with anxiety because you have no friend. You see someone and you say, you come to them in a little voice and say, will you be my friend? Right? Right? Protection against the other. Right? So Facebook is very interesting because in a way, I don't know how conscious they were or not, but they ask you, when you go on Facebook, you get all these requests, do you want to be my friend? No, you can say no. But it's not even a real friend, right? It's a virtual friend. It's a friend of superficiality. Real friendship is, as all you know, is very complex. Riddled with huge complexity, jealousy, envy, solidarity, kindness, bitterness, deceitfulness, right? This is friendship, right? It's a poison chalice and a blessing. And sometimes it's one, sometimes the other, often it's all mixed up. The point of all of this is that this communication technology, Facebook, relies upon inventing the public. Inventing the public sphere in a way no theorist could have imagined. Right? Because Habermas thought of the public sphere, bourgeoisie, for feudalization, and he sees it initially as a limited public sphere for ceremonial and other for the bourgeoisie to form consensus. Very important. Of course, if you read your Marx, real Marx, well, of course, 1848 is a big moment because it's the bursting of the society of this liberal democratic promise for rights and freedoms in public. So, and of course Nancy Fraser tells us that the public sphere was for guys, not for girls, which is true too, and everyone else was excluded. So even if you go back and you read George Lukács, or Mannheim, or any of your other favorites, the public sphere was quite odd. It didn't include a lot of people. So, you know, theoretically we thought it included people. In fact, it marginalized many people. If you were gay, you were lesbian, you were black, you were yellow, you were Jewish. There was always a reason to kick people out of the public sphere. Now, this doesn't mean the public sphere isn't worth fighting for, but of course you have to fight for it because it's the place where people can gather and change, make changes through ideas, through assembly, through collective action. So this idea of things, of the mania to tell all, is very rich and exciting for us because it represents the creative period of the new information technology. And people use technology very differently. So, you can be a skeptic or a cynic. So when Twitter came along, this is what I said to one of my graduate students. Daniel, I want to do this paper on Twitter. Jagris is her name. Jagris, well, let's talk about Twitter. I said something like, well, you know, it's used for celebrity culture, for book launches, for a variety, you know, it's sort of trivial. It trivializes deeper forms of communication. Now, this was before Twitter was used in the Arab Spring. I was wrong, totally wrong. You see, we're skeptical about advances because we didn't see how Twitter, my daughter, I think, or my wife. So we didn't see how it could be used to mobilize thousands of people in the Arab Spring time. And it became a very significant resource. And remember this most famous tableau in Cairo when they turned off the internet. I saw it for a while. I had my PowerPoint. I have a slide of this. So usage goes up. They turn off, the juice, and then it falls like that. And then Google said, "We have a solution. You can phone in your Twitter text, and we will transform it into letters. We'll transform it into text. Voice can be transformed into text, right? Through new technology. So you speak, you can say, I want a reservation, and then that could be transformed, but you wouldn't think they could handle thousands and thousands of people, but they did, and then they turned it back on. So the point of this is that we have to have these legitimating moments where it's used in a different purpose from what it may have been intended for. Give many examples of this. Right? So every time there is an event like the Obama presidency, or the Arab Spring time, or in Iran, where thousands of people gathered to protest the fraudulent elections, or in Russia. Now this is a really backward country. Here you have these guys, two guys, like czars, running the country. They hold an election. They kind of run the show, all the public, all the mass media, and they say, Putin won by 49.3%. And then, of course, there were a few thousand people who were quite courageous, right, in Moscow. And then, before I left, I saw there were about 12,000 or 15,000 people. So we can see this is a resource to be used for mobilization purposes. So, how are we doing for time? So, two criteria then. First, if there's no bounce, that is, people talk and walk, then there is just a kind of talk shop. Everyone is just talking, but no one's acting. There's no movement from online to offline. That's the critical dimension. And we don't know why it succeeds. And other times it fails. You have to be, I think, very candid about this. You can't over-theorize this. You can't say people can be connected, but they can become indifferent. This is my 10th request that I be at a demonstration. This is the 14th petition. This is so on and so forth. You know, information also makes you, it can desensitize you. You have to get too much of it. You get swamped. And secondly, of course, there is an attempt by the state apparatus, by the state and the multinationals, to take back the agenda, the public agenda. That's the Foucaultian needle. Neil Young has a very good song about the needle. So, you know, there's a bit of a play on the word, the needle being heroin that people inject into their arms. Not good stuff. But he has a very good song about this. One, I can't remember what it is. I know about he lived with the drug culture in California. So, though he was, I won't go, he's a Canadian actually. He lived outside of Canada for many years, but he's, of course, he's a great songwriter of our time. But clearly, we have to see whether this whole project of the social movement, social media, is turned around. So right now we're in the ascendant period, but it could be in the descendant period. So we have to think about whether there will be some moment where the information commons will become the tragedy of the commons. Right? We never know when this will occur, but there is something cyclical about change from the positive to a much more problematic period. So that's a big question mark.